Hello, Michigan Realtors, and welcome back to the Letter of the Law. Last month, we looked at the statutory duties and services owed by a licensee under a service provision agreement. Today, we turn our attention to a commonly misunderstood role, that of the transaction coordinator. A number of realtors have inquired as to whether they can avoid the statutory duties and services by acting as a transaction coordinator. As stated earlier, the duties and services listed in the code only apply in an agency relationship. By definition, a transaction coordinator does not have an agency relationship with either party. Realtors should keep in mind, however, that the restrictions on the role of transaction coordinator are such that its use is really quite limited. A transaction coordinator's role was developed from century-old case law holding that a real estate broker who introduced a buyer to a farmer could collect a commission as a middleman, so long as he did not negotiate on behalf of either party. Now, when acting as a transaction coordinator, a realtor simply introduces the buyer to the seller, and the parties conduct any negotiations or other activities necessary to acquire the property on their own. If a transaction coordinator accidentally slips out of his or her neutral role, then he or she forfeits any right to a commission. While it seems like common sense that a transaction coordinator must remain in the neutral role, there are a number of reported instances where a self-professed transaction coordinator seeks to list a property. Now, a transaction coordinator cannot list property for sale. In order to list property for sale in an MLS, a realtor must be an agent of the seller. A listing agent can be a limited services agent, but would still be acting in an agency capacity. When a seller has a listing agent, a transaction coordinator can introduce the buyer to the transaction, but the transaction coordinator cannot represent the buyer. In this case, the transaction coordinator is still a neutral party. Here, the transaction coordinator is, in effect, bringing the buyer and the listing agent together so they can make the deal. But what if there is no other licensee involved in the transaction? How much assistance can a neutral transaction coordinator provide to the parties? The applicable century-old case law speaks only of bringing the parties together and letting them put the deal together. In today's world of much more complicated real estate transactions, as a practical matter, it is seldom the case that once introduced, a buyer and seller can simply put the transaction together on their own. Questions often come up as to what additional assistance the transaction coordinator can provide, if any. While it is certainly the case that a transaction coordinator cannot be involved in the price negotiations, are there other more administrative type services that a transaction coordinator can provide? For example, can a transaction coordinator assist the parties in completing the purchase agreement, order title work, locate an inspector? Now, there are no definite answers to these questions, and it is certainly true that the more assistance that a transaction coordinator provides, the more likely he or she will be deemed to have stepped out of the neutral role and have forfeited the right to a commission. In summary, a transaction coordinator cannot list property or represent the buyer. A transaction coordinator must at all times remain neutral. Case law states that the transaction coordinator can introduce the parties and let them put the transaction together. Each additional service beyond that makes it more likely that a court would conclude that the licensee has stepped outside the role of a transaction coordinator and therefore forfeited his or her right to a commission. For this reason, realtors are discouraged from attempting to use the transaction coordinator role in their day-to-day business. Well, from time to time, a realtor may run across a transaction in which the transaction coordinator role makes sense. It is not a one-size-fits-all replacement for an agency relationship. As usual, thank you for watching and providing such valuable suggestions for this video series. If you enjoy the Letter of the Law format, please consider visiting ondemand.mirealtors.com for legal continuing education opportunities. And keep those suggestions coming to the email below. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.